Presentation on President Dwight Eisenhower and the 1950s by Ryder Shifley, Matt McGay, and Will Markison. Now let's start by stating the prompt. President Eisenhower was successful in his attempts to calm American fears over the Cold War during the 1950s. Now our thesis, although Eisenhower attempted to keep the American public optimistic about the Cold War, his drastic measures in his foreign and domestic policies made the American public believe communism was a much bigger threat than it actually was. Even though Eisenhower did make advances to attain the nuclear edge, he failed to address the American public of this advantage, keeping the American public in fear of the nuclear destruction. While Eisenhower did create a stable American economy, his foreign policies, such as the rollback policy, created unnecessary fears that originated to provide false motives covering and protection of international markets. This led to a nationwide paranoia of communist threat that would eventually reach American soil. Fears of the Cold War. Start with civilian fears. People were taught throughout schools and communities to prepare for nuclear attack. Many bought bunkers, bombshells, and prepped food to be prepared for an attack. It was not a matter of if it was going to happen, but when it would happen. Rumors in American society, such as the missile gap theory, gave the American public the idea that Russia had a nuclear edge on the U.S., creating more hysteria in society. An example of Eisenhower's reaction to the Cold War fears was exemplified at a press conference in 1954 when he explained to the public that they possessed too much hysteria and that would lead to job loss, which made them more vulnerable to attack. Through this, he tries to reassure Americans and quell their fears by they are overreacting to a minuscule problem. Now, the fear of communism. The overreaction of President Eisenhower about the threat of communism created a nationwide paranoia of its spread. The Russian spies that were revealed to the American public furthered this paranoia and made the threat of a communist globe larger than it ever could be. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles argued that we needed to intervene on Latin American countries because of their communist rise so they would not spread to the USA. Relevant to this is the domino theory, which is the fear of the U.S. that communism would reach after Latin American countries, so they wanted to intervene. President Eisenhower's domestic policies. He expanded Social Security, created a booming time in the economy and the markets. He also created the CIA, which basically was the claimed role as the international policeman. Eisenhower stated, "I despise McCarthy's tactics, and even during the political campaign of 1952, I not only stated publicly that I disapproved of those methods, but I did so in his own state." This shows that he ran on the platform against anti-communist campaigns and quelled the fears of the public by not acknowledging it. In contrast, he increased military spending, showing communism was a real threat to him, even though he told the public otherwise. His foreign policy. Like I said, he created the CIA, but mainly to topple governments and countries seen as pursuing communist ideals. They had strong economic interests in many of these countries, but even if they were trying to stop communism, these countries were pursuing nationalization of lands and were not practicing communism. His use of the CIA for economic advances led to instability in the Third World. For example, the CIA overthrew Jacobo Arbenz to protect the economic interests of the United Fruit Company in Guatemala. This happened in Guatemala. In Iran, the CIA put Shah Pahlavi in the place of Mohammad Mossadegh to protect the oil rights of British Petroleum. The secrecy of the CIA kept the American public in the dark and kept them fearing communism. Eisenhower's practice of brinkmanship pushed to the brink of war and left Americans wondering if war would occur. It was very unpredictable and risky. Continuing on with foreign policy. Many of Eisenhower's administration officials, including John Foster Dulles and his brother Alan, who headed the CIA, owned stock in the company, proving that the U.S. may have entered these countries for economic reasons. In the case of Iran, the CIA instigated a communist riot so they could then take out the elected leader under the reason of communism and not economic interests. This then increased fears of communism in the Third World, when really this communism was built up as a hoax to convince the people that going in these countries was necessary. The opposition. Let's look at the opposing side of this argument real quick. The opposing side of our argument, Eisenhower stabilized the American economy and lowered the risk of a communist revolution in the United States. He increased spending in education to create a more competitive technological culture that would outspace the USSR. He did attempt to gain better relations with Russian leader Nikita Khrushchev in the Geneva Conference, but his use of U-2 spy planes ruined this relationship and made matters even worse. Now, overall, on this debate, we disagree with the prompt, and that he was unsuccessful at doing so. Overall, Eisenhower was unsuccessful in his attempts to quell the fears of the American public. While he was able to stabilize the economy, create a more educated country, and gain better relations with Russia, he overreacted to the communist threat and induced a state of paranoia in the United States. He failed to properly communicate with Americans, as seen with the missile gap theory, and left them squandering in their paranoia. His inability to recognize the communist threat as weak and almost non-existent was the main reason he failed to quell the fears of the American public. Thank you. This has been a Prezi presentation.